Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rob Cipio. I am a Deputy Director with the Division of Criminal Justice. This is the training with regards to the transgender policy that came out. As you are aware, we are required in March to have this provided to all law enforcement agencies. You are required to review the video prior to June 1st. This is the training with regards to the directive that came out. So we're going to be talking about the training and talking about law enforcement interactions with transgender individuals. Fair use, everything that we have here is consistent with 17 U.S.C. 107. With regards to the training, we need to give credit where credit is due. And so AAG Jeremy Feigenbaum, AAG Joseph Walsh, DAG Kirsten Kruger, DAG Marie McGovern, DAG Robin Mitchell, and SDAG Robert Cipio Jr., myself, actually were involved in the creation of this PowerPoint for your training purposes. There are two core principles when we're talking about the policy and the reason why we need this policy. One reaffirms New Jersey's strong commitment against non-discrimination. The other deals with equal treatment. So for non-discrimination, a law enforcement officer must never discriminate against a person based upon gender identity or sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation. For equal treatment, a law enforcement officer must treat people consistent with their gender identity. Easy way to remember this, a transgender female must be treated like a female. If we were to boil this whole training down, the next 5 hours of training I have with you, I'm kidding, only 45 minutes. A transgender female must be treated like a female. A transgender male must be treated like a male. So why this training? Why this directive? Well, the numbers provide us that there's around approximately 1.4 million adults and around 150,000 juveniles that identify as transgender and identify themselves as transgender. Transgender individuals regularly report that they're somewhat or very uncomfortable asking the police for help when they need it. Less likely to report crimes, as a result be victims of crimes, first of all, then secondly, less likely to report crimes because of their status or perceived status. What's our commitment? Our commitment and New Jersey's commitment, the law enforcement community, includes many LGBTQ+ members among its ranks. Among the law enforcement community, there are members across the board of the LGBTQ+. It's our commitment further and duty to make sure that all members of our community feel safe and comfortable when asking for help. The policy itself is based upon New Jersey's role and specifically New Jersey's law against discrimination, NJSA 10:5-1 at SEEK. Importantly, New Jersey is at the forefront of ensuring that all transgender individuals are treated with respect, full of recognition and of their legal rights. The previous statute that I talked about is one of the broadest, most inclusive, and strongest laws against discrimination in the United States. It prevents discrimination based upon marital or domestic partnership, civil union status, sex or gender identity or expression in either employment, housing, public accommodation, credit, or contracting as well. The goal of the directive is really simple. The purpose and goal is to ensure that all transgender, non-binary, and will define what a non-binary individual means, or gender non-conforming, and will define what that definition means as well, are simply treated with the dignity and respect, enjoy the full protections for which they are entitled. Now, the policy has an appendix to it. The policy has many parts to it concerning this. What's this policy going to be dealing with? Your interaction with an individual who is a member of the transgender community. It involves searches, it involves interaction, it involves things to say, things to talk about. Write down the pronouns and best practices with regards to dealing with an individual who is a member of the transgender community so that they enjoy full protections that they are entitled. The one thing with regards to the policy that we want to stress is that nothing in the policy is meant to either displace or generally applicable policies with regards to LGBTQ rights across the board, nor does it in fact in any way, shape, or form displace applications to protect transgender policies in previous policies and directives, including the Immigration Trust Directive in 2018-6 and Attorney General Directive 2018-5 dealing with protocols for sexual assault responses. So the first thing we need to understand is, in order to understand certain things, is definitions. So LGBTQ+, what's that? It's an acronym that represents lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning individuals. The Q may stand for queer, for example. As a plus sign shows, it is not meant to be exhaustive, and as used in this directive, this is simply an umbrella term which includes non-binary, gender non-conforming, or intersex individuals. Gender identity, what is this? A person's internal deeply held knowledge with regards to their own gender, regardless of the gender which they were assigned at birth. All people have gender identity, just simply not transgender individuals. Gender expression, a person's gender-related appearance and behavior, whether or not stereotypically associated with a person's gender assigned at birth. It is a manner in which a person represents or expresses their gender to others, such as their behavior, clothing, hairstyles, activities, voice, and mannerisms. Transgender refers to an individual whose identity or gender expression differs from societal expectations associated with the gender they are assigned at birth. Being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. The term is used as an adjective, transgender person. We're not using them as noun and verbs, so we're not using it as transgenders or transgendered, but rather a transgender person is the appropriate way to use the word. Definitions, transgender man. This is a term, the term for transgender person who is assigned a female at birth but identifies as a man. So again, a transgender person who is assigned a female at birth but identifies as a man. Transgender woman. This is a transgender person who is assigned male as a birth but identifies as a woman. Cisgender. This is a person whose gender assigned at birth, sometimes referred to as the sex assigned at birth, matches their gender identity. For instance, if a person is assigned a female at birth and self-identifies as a woman or girl, then that person is cisgendered. Non-binary. This is a term used by people whose gender is not exclusively male or female. The term also captures those with more than one gender or no gender at all. Individuals whose gender neither male nor female may use the terms to describe themselves, such as gender fluid, agender, bigender, or gender expansive. Gender nonconforming. This is a person whose gender expression does not conform with the traditional gender expectations. Not all gender nonconforming people identify as transgender. Gender transition, a process during which a person begins to live according to their gender identity rather than the gender in which they are assigned at birth. Gender transition looks different for different individuals. Possible steps in gender transition may or may not include changing one's clothing, appearance, name, and in some cases, changing identification documents or undergoing medical treatments. The steps each person takes depends on the individual needs and access to resources. Chosen name. This is a name selected by a person for themselves that is different from the name that they are given at birth. An individual may have chosen a name for themselves that is more accurately reflects their gender identity or expression. So those are some basic terms that we're talking about. The policy is based upon two really core principles. The first core principle deals specifically with non-discrimination. Core principle number one. An officer may not use a person's gender identity or expression or sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation as a factor in deciding whether or not the person may be involved in a criminal activity or in deciding how to treat a person, except when the officer is pursuing specific leads in an ongoing criminal investigation or trying to determine whether the individual matches the description for a BOLO. Be on the lookout. General concepts of non-discrimination. This is a core principle that expands the same non-discrimination rules that exist for race and ethnicity to gender identity or expression or sexual orientation. The case law has been clear in the state of New Jersey, for example, that we can't use race as a basis to do an interaction. We can't use an age of a juvenile, for example, or an individual if we're doing a field inquiry for certain instances. Here, we are expanding those basic core principles and now expanding that non-discrimination rule for law enforcement purposes for gender identity or expression or sexual orientation as well. Directive requirements. Law enforcement officers shall not harass, discriminate against individuals based upon their actual perceived gender identity or expression and or sexual orientation. Includes using offensive or derogatory words to describe the LGBTQ plus individuals. Couple of other shall nots. The directive requirements: to avoid engaging in such discrimination, law enforcement officers shall not fail to respond to, delayed responding to, or treat with less important any call, request for service or assistance because of the individual's actual perceived identity or sexual identity or expression or sexual orientation. Shall not consider a person's actual perceived gender, identity, or expression or sexual orientation as a basis for reasonable suspicion or prima facie evidence that the person has or is about to commit evidence of a crime or engage in a crime. Shall not stop, question, search, arrest, or detain any individual or subject or any more individuals or based upon invasive search procedures because of that individual's actual perceived gender identity, expression, and or sexual orientation. Shall not question, search, arrest, or detain an individual or subject to search because the individual has used a restroom that the officer knows was consistent with that individual's gender identity or expression, or shall not question, stop, search, arrest, or detain in order to determine an individual's genitals or anatomy to assign a gender for them. The directive requirements. Under New Jersey law against discrimination, individuals who use a restroom or changing room that is consistent with their gender identity or expression, regardless of the gender they were assigned at birth and or their anatomical characteristics, they may use. You cannot arrest an individual based solely upon that. Gender directives. Law enforcement officers shall not inquire about details of a person's sexual practices, genitalia, or anatomy unless doing so is necessary for as part of an ongoing criminal investigation or the individual raises the issues without prompting by the officer. The officer's inquiries are tailored to ensure the individual's safety, dignity during the law enforcement interaction. The directive requires that law enforcement officers shall not disclose to an individual's LGBTQ plus status or gender assigned at birth to members of the public unless a proper law enforcement purpose requires such disclosure and the officer documents the purpose in writing or the individual agrees to such disclosure. Ladies and gentlemen, what's all these things mean? Respect. Respectful communication is extremely important. So respectful communication, transgender individuals' chosen names and pronouns are critical to dignity and identity for the transgender community. Using the right pronouns. What shall you do? Respectfully communicate with a transgender individual. So for example, address individuals using their chosen names that reflect their identity, gender identity, even if the name is not the one recognized on any official legal records, and even if the name changes over time as well as their chosen pronouns. Include the chosen names and chosen pronouns in all relevant documentation. Use the chosen names and pronouns in any communications about that individual with members of the public, including with the press, except when doing so would impermissibly disclose the individual's LGBTQ plus status, and except where necessary in filing legal filings and communications about those filings. Respectful communication includes recognizing that some transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals' government-issued identification may reflect the gender assigned at birth rather than their own gender identity. For the love of God, please don't charge them with some sort of obstruction charge if the name they give you does not match their license. In such a scenario, law enforcement officers should respectfully ask the individual, what pronoun do you use? Law enforcement officers should never ask any physical or anatomical proof of gender questions as well. One thing I want to highlight for you here is that pursuant to a recent law in New Jersey, transgender individuals on their licenses actually may use an X box, specifically on the license itself. That indicates either transgender with the X marking, undesignated non-binary identification, or the individual is transgender. So if you see that on licenses, that is a new thing that started to occur last year. So do's. Ascertain the gender identity. Do respectfully ask someone, what pronoun do you use? What pronoun do you prefer? Do. Why are we recommending this, or why does the policy require this? To ensure the individual's rights and dignity are protected. There's one thing we know with regards to any law enforcement action with an individual, and that's this. If you treat the individual with respect, they will in turn treat you with respect as well. An easy way to de-escalate someone is to respectfully treat them, to give them respect, even when they're not necessarily giving you the respect that you think you deserve. Terminologies don't. Law enforcement officers should avoid certain terms. For example, hermaphite, preferred intersex person. Sex change, preoperative or postoperative, preferred transitioning or transition. Transgender as a noun and verb, it is always an adjective, like a transgender person would be an example of that. Don't. Law enforcement officers shall never use any type of slurs or words which are perceived as slurs in the actual community. They include she, male, he, she, it, transvestite, tranny or tranny, dyke, faggot, gender bender as well. These are all terms which law enforcement officers should not use. Now, one thing that I do want to highlight for you is this. In your interaction with an individual with the transgender community, you shouldn't use those terms. If you're investigating a bias crime and it's alleged that a defendant used those terms to describe a victim who's a transgender community, then your reports are going to memorialize that. That's important for a bias crime investigation. This directive deals solely with your day-to-day interactions with an individual who is a member of the transgender community. Juveniles and interactions with juveniles. All interactions with juveniles shall comply with these rules, including a requirement that officers shall not disclose juveniles' actual perceived gender identity or expression and/or sexual orientation to anyone unless proper law enforcement purpose requires the disclosure and official documents that purposes in writings such disclosure as well. That's core principle number 1. Let's talk about core principle number 2, equal treatment. So the second core principle that the directive is based upon is just that, equal treatment. General rule. Whenever an officer's action depends on gender, the action shall be performed in accordance with the individual's gender identity. So that's our general rule with regards to the transgender directive as rule number 2. In other words, officers must treat a transgender woman as they would treat any other woman. They must treat a transgender man as they would treat any other man as well. This rule applies equally. This rule applies when and only when law enforcement action is based upon gender. Some situations may turn on a person's gender. For example, non-exigent strip searches, cross-gender searches where they're prohibited, gender-segregated detentions and police stations as well. Equal treatment in communication and record keeping. An individual's chosen name or chosen pronoun should be noted appropriately to all relevant documentation. A chosen name or chosen pronouns in addition to separate spaces already included for an alias or nickname is where we're going to place chosen name. Officers should record the individual's legal name as stated on the government-issued identification document as well as other legal paperwork under legal name in all department forms and records as well. For searches, for the purposes of conducting a search, officers shall treat a transgender woman as they would treat any other woman. Officers shall treat a transgender man as they would treat any other man, regardless of the gender of the individual, that the individual was assigned at birth, and or anatomical characteristics at the time of the interaction. So for searches, if we're talking about an exigent circumstance, if we're talking about a search incident to a valid arrest, we're talking about a Terry frisk for weapons, we're talking about other public safety, a paramount, where we're dealing with that interaction, where we have an exigent circumstance, hot pursuit, let's say. There's no change with how we've done things. State versus Dickey still applies, where there's reasonable safety concerns. You may handcuff an individual during a field inquiry. You may conduct a search incident to a lawful arrest, where the sex of the individual really doesn't come into play. Where this policy changes things is those searches that are not based upon exigent circumstances. General rule, then, if only a female can search a cisgender woman, then only a female can search a transgender woman. General rule number 1. General rule number 2. If only a male officer can search a cisgender man, then only a male officer can search a transgender man. Rule number 2. And again, these are in non-exigent circumstances that we're talking about. A law enforcement officer may always ask a transgender individual their preference as to the gender of the searching officer as well. One best practice that we recommend, don't ask if you don't have both male and female officers present. So for example, there's no officers available to search a female, then don't ask if the individual would prefer to be searched by a female. For searches, the procedure: when a transgender individual expresses a preference to the gender of the searching officer, 1, you're going to document the preference, and 2, perform all searches in accordance with that preference, if authorized by relevant state, county, local agency as well. There is, of course, a safety concern. With regards to safety concerns, if a safety concern overrides that request for a procedure for a transgender individual, that should be documented as well by the supervisors. Searches. A law enforcement officer shall never require a transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals to remove certain appearance-related items such as prosthetics, bras, clothing, undergarments, wigs, chest binders, or cosmetic items during the search, unless all individuals, regardless of the gender, would be required to move such items during that search as well. Look, we're not talking about a situation where you're looking for weapons. We're not talking about that situation. We're talking about a general situation where there is in fact an arrest, a search is taking place, there is no exigency in that search. Transportation. If transportation is based upon a gender, then transgender men will be transported with men, transgender women will be actually transported with women. Communication and record keeping. For transportation, while officers will continue to follow standard operating procedures for communicating over dispatch, over the radio when transporting a transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals, officers should also be mindful of the arrestee's chosen name and pronouns and should communicate such information to the temporary holding facility or detention facility. When appropriate, to ensure the arrestee's safety, a transporting officer may communicate the individual's identity, gender identity, to temporary holding facility or detention facility. For detention, prisoner logs and other documents used to track prisoners while in custody should also include the individual's chosen name and pronouns to the subsequent shifts of the officers may address the individual appropriately. The next slide deals with detention and temporary detention at police stations. This policy does not change any DOC regulations with regards to, or JJC for juvenile regulations with regards to searches that occur at the jails. It is limited solely to temporary detention at a police station. If a detainee's individuals are held in areas that are segregated on a gender basis upon gender or based upon gender, law enforcement officers shall house, place, or otherwise detain individuals in line with the gender identity or expression, regardless of the gender of the individual was assigned at birth, and or the anatomical characteristics unless otherwise requested. The reason for this, statistically, based upon national studies, transgender individuals in this position are more likely to be victims of additional crimes or violence against them. Detention at a police station. If detained individuals are held in areas that are segregated based upon gender, law enforcement officers shall permit the individuals to use restrooms consistent with their gender identity or expression regardless of the gender of the individual was assigned at birth and or anatomical characteristics. In other words, a transgender woman will be housed with other women unless she requests otherwise. A transgender man will be housed with other men unless requested otherwise. Restrooms will be consistent with their gender identity. Thus, going back to our rules, detention at a police station, when a cisgender woman is housed with other women, then a transgender woman will be housed with other women unless otherwise requested. Similarly, when a cisgender man is housed with men, then a transgender men are also housed with other men as well. So detention at a police station. If a facility has available private cells and or restrooms, law enforcement officers shall not refuse to accommodate a request by a transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming individuals to have a private cell and or use a private restroom when doing so is practicable and ensures the individual's safety. If this request is denied, the denial must be documented in writing, reviewed, and approved by the supervisor on that date in question. Detention at a police station. If a facility has available private cells and or restroom, law enforcement officers shall not require someone to be housed, placed, or otherwise detained in a private cell or use private restroom on a basis of the person's actual perceived gender identity or expression or sexual orientation absent such a request. So we're dealing with detentions in a police station. Law enforcement officers shall never deny transgender individuals access to any items, including clothing, personal property, or appearance-related items such as prosthetics, bras, wigs, undergarments, chest binders, or cosmetics items, and or any programming, including educational programming, when they would allow a cisgender individual of the same gender identity to have, regardless of the gender the individual was assigned at birth and or their anatomical characteristics. One question we may get, anticipating a question, I have a person who is suicidal. Does that mean I have to give them these items? You would not give a person who is potentially suicidal or a threat to commit suicide, a cisgender individual, these items. Same rules apply as a general rule here. Non-binary and gender non-conforming individuals. Some individuals do not identify or express as strictly male or female. Since certain interactions turn on gender, the following rules applies to individuals for the safety of non-binary or gender non-conforming individuals as well. When we're dealing with non-binary or non-conforming individuals, any search, transportation, detention that is not done in accordance with the individual's state of preference must, where practicable, be reviewed or approved by a supervisor. The denial must be documented in writing as well. When conducting searches, the officer shall respectfully inquire of the non-binary or gender non-conforming individuals as to the preference with respect to the gender of the searching officer and performing searches in accordance with their preference when possible in a non-exigent situation. For transportation and detention in police stations, officers shall transport, house, place, or otherwise detain such individuals with individuals or arrestees of the gender that is safest for them, and allow them to use restrooms of the gender that is safest for them, taking into account the gender of the individual or expressing the safest for them. Look, you're all law enforcement officers. If in fact you believe that the individual is using this policy as a basis to become a threat to other inmates, to become a threat to the officer, and it is denied for that reason, that must be documented in this paperwork. Access to medical attention. Law enforcement officers shall never handle an individual's request for medical attention with any less urgency or respect because of that individual's actual or perceived gender identity or expression and/or sexual orientation. Law enforcement officers shall treat prescription hormones like any other prescription medication necessary for an individual's health and well-being. Officers shall also be aware that the transgender individuals may possess needles related to the prescription hormone treatment and/or therapy, and that such possession alone is not necessarily indicative of illegal possession of drugs or drug paraphernalia per se. One other thing with regards to this, do not link possession of condoms to prostitution specific to the transgender community as well. Access to medication. Law enforcement officers shall document any circumstances of any medical treatment pursuant to applicable policies and procedures for your department. This is part of a two-part training process for all law enforcement. All law enforcement officers are required to view this video, be aware of this video prior to June 1st of this year. There's also a more robust 3-hour training dealing with the LGBTQ community that the director requires the Prosecutor and Training Bureau to create. We are this is being recorded in March. We are in the final stages of doing so. That will be provided through the Clear Institute, and you will be able to be given 3 elective credits for Clear credits for that course. If there's any questions concerning this directive or implementation, they shall be directed to the Director, Division of Criminal Justice. Does this policy take an effect? The directive takes an effect on June 1st, 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure talking to you today concerning the policy. Hopefully, again, my name is Rob Sepio, Deputy Director, Division of Criminal Justice. Be safe.